So I'm Daniel Stubbings. I'm a clinical psychologist at Cardiff Metropolitan University. I'm 3 days in this particular role, and I'm 2 days in the National Health Service in cancer and palliative care. I've spent about 7 years working in secure forensic mental health, so I feel like there's almost not an issue that I haven't kind of sort of seen clinically. I first wanted to begin by a slide that's basically curiosity killed the atheist materialist. Now, so before 2020, I would look at a clock and I would say, it's a clock and it's made up of parts and atoms and it exists because I can test it empirically, I can touch it, I can poke it. That's about it. So all the clock, that's all it is. 4 years of UAP study later, I think I'm starting to fall down the rabbit hole, and Donald Huffman, I think, has a pretty good hypothesis that space-time is the software, not the operating system. If you follow where people like Robert Bigelow have gone with their research, essentially consciousness might be primary to space-time. There could be some kind of inherent unity to all things, whether it's UFO, near-death experiences, psychedelics, remote viewing, crop circles, the animal mutilations, abductions, cover-ups, etc., might all be particularly related. And I've started going to my local church. So, to put it mildly, I've had quite a turnaround in the last 4 years, and I was hardcore atheist, kind of Richard Dawkins level, kind of not on his caliber, but with that kind of mindset. So basically, what I'm trying to highlight with my own personal journey is that I often do question, have I been profoundly radicalized or awoken? And trying to work out the difference isn't always easy. Um, but the question then becomes, what will be the mental health journey for everyone else that's going to walk this particular path? So hopefully some of your previous speakers, I wish I could be there in person to hear a bit more. Hopefully they've gone over what's happening in this area, but if not, I'll just give a little brief kind of overview. So basically, at this point in time, there's congressional hearings going on, what seems to be in the classified world and the unclassified world, where the topic of UAP is being taken very, very seriously. It seems like the pinnacle of that is the UAP Disclosure Act that was put forward last year and that was blocked and then is being put forward and now removed and then maybe put back on again this year. It's some serious legislation that kind of covers the issue in quite a lot of detail. And this legislation didn't just come out of nowhere. There seems to have been a history where there was the National Institute for Discovery Science that morphed into the ORSAP program that was funded by Harry Reid, that then moved on into the ATIP program, then eventually the UAP task force. And the current kind of iteration is that ARROW, the All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, that has some pros and cons about it. So either way, there is some serious kind of levels of US government that are taking this topic seriously, which is part of what's made me take it so seriously. It's also worth bearing in mind that any one piece of information in this story is incomplete. But when you step back and look at the volumes and you're brave enough to peer into the abyss of this topic, it seems like there's genuinely something going on. You wouldn't have top colonels like people, Colonel Carnell coming forward and risking their reputations, all these pilots kind of coming forward in classified settings. It would surprise me as more fanciful that they would be coming forward and it's all untrue. Lou Elizondo's book, if you don't know, Imminent, covers kind of quite a lot of interesting things about his time in ATIP. There does seem to be a safety of flight issue. They do seem interested in our nuclear assets, whatever these things are. And there's more and more cases coming forward. The Nightcrawler case, where these two guys are monitoring UAP off the Long Island beach, and something comes down into the water and seems to temporarily paralyze them. You can go watch it on YouTube, their experience. They kind of captured it all with multiple cameras. Fascinating. There's the Galileo project. NASA allegedly are studying the topic, but they haven't done much in the years since they've admitted to having their own program. There was the February shootdowns last year, and we've only just got one of the potential pictures that started being released through Freedom of Information Act. The Five Eyes alliance between Canada, Australia, UK, America, evidence has come out that they have been occurring. So they are meeting and discussing something, and I would certainly like to know what it is that exactly they're discussing. And there seems to be lots more in the works. It's rumored that 30th of November, there's going to be another congressional hearing. Maybe it's on underwater submergible objects. There's the program coming out by James Fox, potentially Jay Stratton's book next year. There's Soul Foundation, another conference coming up, the New Paradigm Institute, Unhidden in the UK, which is kind of a a proposed charity to support people with mental health well-being around the UAP topic, UAP Med, etc., etc. There's lots going on in this topic. Just three areas of things that have been done before. So quite an old study now, but by Ramirez and colleagues, called the FREE study. I can't remember the full acronym for it, but essentially that's the largest scale descriptive statistical kind of case where they could have had 3,000 kind of participants, lots of questionnaires about their experiences, some of it abduction, some of it not, all around their UAP exposure. It's a good study. It's worth looking up, but the problem with that, it's largely descriptive statistics. So it's nothing really experimental or in-depth or follow-up about it, but it is a very useful study to look into. There's also the famous John Mack, who's now deceased. He was a psychiatrist, which is different from a psychologist. Psychiatrists are medical doctors that then prescribe medication for mental health issues rather than the psychologist who does the formulations and more of the psychological treatment. But he is quite well known for trying to treat people who have had abduction experiences. But again, there was no formalized case study approach to doing that, no psychometric data that I'm aware of that he sort of published. And it's not really, his books, as great as they are, it's not really how you conduct a psychological science kind of multiple case study series. And then there's the incredible work by Tim Lomas, who's released a series of studies, one in particular on ontological shock that's sort of worth reading. So he's a name worth looking up. Yingling and Bell in 2023 also looked into academics and their awareness of this topic, and basically found that most weren't really aware of it, but there was starting to be a growing interest. So there's also Professor Rayburn, who he's based in France, and he's been treating people who have had anomalous experiences. So it's far wider than just UAP, UFO abduction experiences. So more poltergeists and ghosts and other kinds of anomalous experiences, because it seems like there's a lot of paranormal experiences that go along with the UAP topic. And his paper in the Frontiers of Psychology is worth looking up as a model for how we can approach the treatment of people with these anomalous kinds of experiences. But it still doesn't represent what I'd call psychological science. Now, for those of you, most of you, I assume, are academics to some extent, and you should know that science works as a collective. And so this picture that I've got on the right is, if you think of the ball of problems that make up the UAP topic, so on an almost infinite number of points for understanding. Now, my three little projects are three little dots in that wider system. And each black dot, it represents some other study that needs doing to understand this topic. Now, I think I looked up a recent statistic that there was in the USA, there's 130,000 bachelor psychology degrees. Now, that might be overkill, might be more than is needed, but either way, that's a lot of students. Now, if 1% of those did what I got my students to do, which is focus on the UAP topic, we could have 1,300 projects a year. So I guess what I'm trying to do actually by this whole talk is kind of advocate that the academia needs to really think about which free resources they have to be able to utilize and to explore this topic, because even if a fraction of it started being used to focus on this UAP issue, we could use our expertise to fill in more of these black dots and hopefully figure out more about what's going on. So let's move on to the three projects that I've done. So I've got no money to do the work. I need to also not embarrass the university. They're basically also kind of, there's the risk of reputational harm. There's a lot of stigma that comes with this topic. So there's a higher level of quality and rigor that I need to approach with this topic. And as much as if somebody offered me the opportunity to interview aliens and talk to them about their deep, dark feelings and the shock they've had and seeing what humanity does, there's no way I'd get that through ethics. So basically, I've got to start softly with this topic, because I need to build rapport with my institution to say, we can do this, we can try and publish, and it's not going to sink us or embarrass us too much. And unfortunately, it's something we've got to navigate. So the first study I had was like, okay, well, why don't we start looking at what some experiences of the phenomenon think that their mental health and social needs are? So this is a very neglected group in society that have basically been gaslit and told that what they've seen doesn't really exist. So I, through my network, located 4 people who seemed credible from their accounts. They didn't appear to have psychosis or other massive major mental health issues. I didn't assess their mental health issues in detail because I did not think that's the point of the study. It's more to try and take them at face value the best I kind of could. And I was doing a little qualitative project to ask them a series of questions around what was their personal impact of having the UAP exposure. Now, what emerged from their interviews and transcripts was these themes, doing a thematic analysis. So one category seemed to be there's a psychological impact to being an experiencer, where there's potentially a degree of ontological shock, um, but that is not a uniformed response. There's quite a degree of emotional variability in how people respond. There's also a social impact. Now, one of the participants said, look, if I talk about this stuff, people will think you're nuts. And that kind of summarized that kind of group of comments. Then there's a psychosocial dispossession. It's almost like once they've crossed the Rubicon and become an experiencer, they might not fit in with other people so much, in the sense that if you're not an experiencer and you're not in this topic, people, it's difficult to talk to your GP about it, or your other health professionals, or family members. There's just there's this sort of dispossession that kind of happens, and these elements lead to some unmet needs, where there's a need for respect and care. I'm just going to read some quotes from participants on this. So, ontological shock. This is what one person said after they saw a UAP for the first time, kind of quite up close. They said, you start to psychologically disintegrate because it takes away everything you thought you knew, and it doesn't take it away overnight. It takes it away in 1 second. You know? So it's kind of another one suggested how they ran to a priest for information because they were just felt like it was so godlike, the experience that they kind of sort of had. When it comes to people thinking you're nuts, some of the kind of comments, one sort of said, look, he had an experience in late childhood, and he said he went to the teacher and told the teacher what he saw and just was dismissed like, no, you didn't see that. And it really affected him for the years after in his life, with just being sort of dismissed like that. And he had other UAP experiences throughout his life. Another one said, you feel isolated, you feel very much alone, and you feel like bringing it up, you're going to be stigmatized and you're going to be ridiculed. And it has happened. I've spoken to about aspects of this, and you see people's eyes just rolling, and you know it's traumatizing. About the psychosocial dispossession, many of them talk, well, the participants talked about needing medication or being suggested medication, particularly for psychosis, and they found it kind of, they're like, look, I just want help dealing with this. I don't want to take medication to deal. I wasn't unwell or psychotic. In terms of respect, one participant said, I'm seeing something that's just not supposed to exist. It's like I'm seeing that something that's got no visible means of propulsion. It's got no wings. It's just there. And validation is what I need. I think that's what I need from all this disclosure talk, is validation. It's being able to talk about it without being ridiculed. It's about not being afraid to acknowledge it publicly, or even be able to talk about it just as a normal experience. And they also wanted care. So time I kind of crack on to the next study. So that's what I found from the first study. So there's unmet needs of respect and care. There seems to be an element of shock. Nothing's particularly surprising in these findings. It's sort of, but the university were happy with that, so I carried on with my study too. Now, science should move in small incremental steps. So this is where I found a previous paper by Swami and colleagues in 2016 that essentially found that people who believe in UFOs are more likely to be superstitious, have paranoid ideation, and high in kind of openness. Now, I don't necessarily. It wasn't a bad study. The issue though is that it was about people who believe in UFOs. Now I thought, well, why don't I just apply this methodology and look at those who claim to have seen them, because maybe people who believe in UFOs are not the same group that have seen them. So this was the study 2 design. We had the big 5: neuroticism, extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness, and schizotypy, which is another kind of personality characteristic. And I wanted to see, did they or did they not predict having had a sighting? So is it a certain kind of person that says they've had a sighting? And if they did have a sighting, I wanted to find out what was it and did they report it? So basically I had 206 participants, which was enough power to detect an effect if there was one. And I did find people who had seen UFOs were higher on agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness. And they had a bit of a belief that there should be need for further scientific research. But they also were lower on neuroticism, and a social anxiety subfeature of schizotypal kind of personality. But although it was significant, the effect sizes were small. So a big enough sample for anything, you'll find something significant, but it's really about the effect size. So the pictures on the side show a small to big effect size, and it was more towards the small effect size. So really, yes, there's significant differences, but they're really not that big. Now, looking at the personality profiles as clusters across the six different domains, there was two different patterns of responding. Now, the gray line are those that are high in extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness, but low in neuroticism and schizotypy. The dotted line is the reverse of that. People who are basically not extroverts, they're not agreeable, they're not conscientious, but emotional and neurotic and very high on schizotypy, which is sort of a little bit more sort of kind of chaotic thinking. Now, and then the black line in the middle is just average on these things. But we did find a significant difference between the grey group and the dotted group. So essentially, those who were more conscientious, agreeable, and open were more likely to report having seen a UAP. Now, does that mean more open, agreeable people see UAP, or is it that people who are neurotic, schizotypal, don't go outside so much, they're a bit more prone to anxiety, they're not looking up, they're not interested in these things, they're not conscientious, and even if they had to have a sighting, they'd suppress it? Don't know, because I can't, pretend, make a fake UFO and leave some flares and see which ones of the personality styles think it's a UFO versus those that don't. But this pattern is there. So essentially, the stereotypes in the UAP field that you've got some people who are very calm, rational, conscientious experiences of very strange things exist. There's people like that. There's also people who are quite unhinged seeing things. But there are also people who are neurotic, rigid, disagreeable, who just focus on debunking. And there's also people who are very, very calm, open, and interested in the topic, but skeptical. Sorry, I've got a bit of a sore throat. So that's what we found with that. Now, the more interesting findings from that particular study is I think we are the first to find out how many people reported it. Now, Richard Dolan's talked about sort of doing this at conferences and taking people, say, have you seen a UFO? And people stick their hand up and then keep it up if you reported it, and most of them put their hands down. So that's what inspired me to ask this question. And what I found was that only 14% of my 203 participants reported it anywhere, like to MUFON or NUFON, which means that whatever the statistics are for the number of sightings of UFOs, the real number is likely to be about 85 times higher. So I think we're the first to kind of report on that. Why didn't they report it? Well, stigma, they didn't know where. So many didn't see the point, or they were too young. There was a range of reasons. So the takeaway from that is that we're not capturing the frequency of how much people are seeing these things. And when you compare it to the AARO, which is the Pentagon-led All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, about the kinds of shapes they see in the military pilots versus the general population, my categories weren't exactly the same, but it's kind of similar. About 3% see the tic-tac kind of canister shape. About 2 to 5% see the disc. I had quite a few more people see a triangle compared to the AARO data, and then square, rectangle. So it's most people see some kind of glowing orb, star-like thing. The actual more defined shapes are kind of a lot lower in frequency. So that led me on to study 3. So I was trying to sort of whiz through this. Now, the next question I wanted, which was my next year of students, I kind of said, well, since the 1953 Robertson panel, the approach to this topic seems to have been debunk as much as you can, explain it away, trying to push away the topic because they're worried about mass panic as one of the multitude of reasons why to keep this topic secret. So I thought, well, why don't I expose 10 people who know almost nothing about this topic and try and throw the kitchen sink at them? So the best bits of the aerial documentary, the best bits of the congressional hearing, various interviews with the pilots, kind of bits of the UFO Nukes book, just sort of the real hard-hitting things that are verifiable out there in the public and cram it together and expose people to that for 45 minutes. So am I trying to induce a degree of ontological shock? Yeah, maybe. I just wanted to see what people's reactions were. Now, so I measured their personality, measured their mood before and after exposure, measured their belief in UFOs before and afterwards, and I did some qualitative interviews to find out, are you okay? Now, the reflective thematic analysis came into these categories of what I found. So the first category was basically, is it real? So there seems to be this credibility issue. It was quite amazing to me. Like, I literally explained that David Grush has had 40 odd kind of whistleblowers and people that have come to him. He was doing a mandated job by Congress to find out the information, brought the information to the Inspector General. The Inspector General then verified all the information and reported to Congress that it's both urgent and credible. And he's basically giving his testimony under oath where there's risk of prison and fines if he's caught lying. But despite that information, many people in my cohort just went, government lies all the time, making it up. I've seen lots of people lie through COVID. Why would this be any different? Oh, okay. All the way to, so some people would find David Grush really credible, some people not. Some people found the testimony of the school children at the aerial landing in Zimbabwe in the 90s quite impactful. They're like, well, that's pretty impressive. That's a lot of kids and a lot of witnesses, and they look pretty sincere. And others just went, nah, it's absolute rubbish. So, but the consensus amongst all that, the variation in what people thought about it, was that they really just felt there's no good alternative to first-hand experience. So it's almost like the governments could release every single thing about transparency about this topic, and I think unless it shows up in people's back garden, they just might not believe it. Then there was the impact of exposure. Now, universally, they all said that they weren't anxious about what they saw. Maybe that's because they didn't quite believe it or they held some reservation. But they all mentioned the potential. Oh, yeah, some people could really freak out about this. This could really affect people. So there's almost like, oh, I'm not bothered, but yeah, other people could be bothered by it all. So there's this kind of dialectic between the reaction. Then there was also this ontological repositioning about what it might all mean, versus then bouncing back to resisting the possibility of this topic. And then it was also a path forward. They were mostly pro-disclosure. They're like, just let out the information. But there was limits to that disclosure, and I'll kind of go through some of that. So again, as I was saying about the credibility is in the eye of the beholder. I mean, I even showed them Jesse Marcel, the guy who held up the piece of tin foil at the Roswell pictures in the 1940s, and him as an old man saying, look, I was staged to do that, essentially, and the real material would just fold back. And some people found him really credible, and others thought it was irrelevant rubbish. Same as Lou Elizondo's interview on some of his podcasts around that if people knew what he knew, that they'd sort of say it was quite somber. Some people would found that talk quite impactful, others didn't. I think I've been through some of these. The absence of fear. So one participant, again, they weren't afraid, so they said it doesn't really bother them. But then they kind of went on to say, look, that bit stuck in my mind where he was saying, look, we're not in charge. The human race, we're not at the top of the food chain. And I was like, oh my God. And I was like, that's a threat, maybe to humanity. So there was this juxtaposition between them saying, I'm not scared, that's fine, I can handle it. And then there's these kind of, they sort of look off in the distance and say some of these things that kind of indicated something else. In terms of the disclosure sensitivity, I asked them all about, do you think we should tell children about this information and this public stuff that's out there? And most of them universally said, oh, I'm not sure about that, maybe an 11-year-old, maybe, but they're not really mature enough to know. Definitely under 10, don't say anything. Another one said, I think kids should always be shielded somewhat, but I think too much shielding does the opposite effect of protecting them. So I think it's good for them to know, but it's just how to do that and who decides who should be told what. So it's almost like they were pro-disclosure, but with limits and caveats, which was interesting to me. So the implications of the 3 studies. The first one was that people witnessing these things, whether real or not real, is almost irrespective. The witnessing of it has profound personal and tangible effects on them as people and socially. and there is a lack of professional services for them. Study 2 was the finding was that all kinds of people see UAP, and most never get kind of reported. Study 3 was that disclosure is probably going to be an individual process for each of the 8 billion people on the planet in its own speed. And the real aim of the work that I was trying to do is to try and encourage that, look, we can as universities look into this topic, try get publications. Study 2 I published, study 3 I'm writing up, study 1 I've got in for a review at the moment. But yes, we can try and publish these things, and little by little we can kind of piece it all together. Now, the next study I want to do for my next cohort of students is going to be looking at mental health symptoms at screening in the core 34 and the PTSD symptoms, because I want to find out what's the prevalence of mental health issues, what's the prevalence of adverse trauma in childhood, and what's the impact, what's the prevalence of PTSD, both UAP related and non-UAP related, in the cohort of experiences, because I don't know of any descriptive statistics that actually show any kind of prevalence data. So it's not the most groundbreaking research, but it's like my attempt is little and often and push where we can. But I've got a few other questions that sort of I've got out there that really I want to look into. It'll just be about, will I get funding? Can I find funding? How much? Which ones can students most interested for me to do? So we, in the psychological sciences, we need to have fresh systematic reviews and updates on all the terrestrial human evidence-based explanations that get mistaken for the phenomenon. So we need to have a better understanding of when it isn't the phenomenon, because so we can narrow down when it is. We also need to monitor the general knowledge that the public have about this topic and do it over time, like a yearly kind of survey, to find out how understanding is going in the general population in different cultures. We need to establish a systematic review protocol for reviewing the historical cases. The ORSAP program had a system of reviewing that, but it's not the a review process that's kind of agreed upon in some peer-reviewed literature isn't really out there. How can psychological interventions then be used to aid self-disclosure is a question in and of itself. We need to develop public policy on how there can be reconciliation with the government if there has been massive cover-ups. How do we increase trust in our institutions again if we have been lied to about this topic? We also need to establish scientifically robust psychological assessments for authentic reporting of the phenomenon to be used in clinical, forensic, and legal contexts. Because I swear, the more this topic goes forward, somebody's going to be doing a job, working at Walmart, then they're going to get harmed by a UAP that goes by, and Walmart aren't going to pay out because they're going to say UAP doesn't exist. What the hell do we do in assessing that in legal settings? We don't have a precedent for that. There's some cases of military cases, like in the Rendlesham Forest case, where people have got paid out, but not for the Joe Blow that experiences UAP in the line of their work, or they have a car accident because they're affected by a UAP, and how that gets played out in the courts. Now, in the forensic world of, say, rape assessments and things like that, we've got assessments that we could use, and I think we can piggyback on what we know from those things to apply it to these kinds of cases. We also need to figure out how do we best assess the psychological needs of experiences. We need to develop treatments for both real and fictitious experiences, because some people are going to be profoundly affected by something that we later find wasn't actually real. And for some, if it turns out to be real, then they also need help as well. We need further scientific investigation into the comorbid topics. So anyone who's studied the UAP topic for any length of time, unfortunately or fortunately, gets dragged into the other topics, the parapsychology, the remote viewing, the psychedelics. It's trying to look for the boundaries of this topic isn't always easy. Then it'd be about what psychological barriers to the world or institutions have to understanding UAP if it becomes more profoundly real to the general population. Then how do we reduce speciesism, prejudice, and unnecessary and just for fear towards non-human intelligence? Then eventually, it might also be trying to develop an understanding of psychology of the non-human intelligences if they're around. Psychology is not the right word. I've been trying to wrap my brains as to what the right one is, but it's how do they think and how do they see the world? And if there's more than one they, how are they perceiving things? So where to from here? encourage greater learning on the topic. I really appreciate you allowing me to sort of speak here, and that the New Paradigm Institute is kind of helping host kind of these events. I think, like I said before, if 1% of academics around the world focus on this topic, we can do a lot of research with the free resources we have in our undergraduate and postgraduate students that are looking into for projects in and of themselves. And then hopefully with enough of a case, we'll get some funding to kind of take it further. It does take a degree of courage to look into the topic, and it's not without its kind of risks. But this topic is either the most incredible topic of our time, or it is the greatest cultural case of mass hysteria we've ever witnessed. So it's the golden ticket for science. You win either way. Either way is a discovery in this topic, no matter what we find. We just need to let the data speak for itself. So my final slide is that I've got 3 little brown dots on the ball of unknowing. I'm trying to know a little bit more. So hopefully you will all go on to fill in more of the dots for me and for others, so we can piece it all together.